We are recording. Cool. Well, welcome to the October edition of the American Baseball Biomechanics Society Journal Club. My name is Arnel Aguinaldo from Point Loma Nazarene University. We've got two, I think, excellent articles that'll be presented by a couple of students, Jared Duane and Ben Lerch. And we also have a member or a representative from Burtech who is the sponsor of this week's Journal Club. So where it works, if this is your first time joining us for Journal Club, is pretty straightforward and informal. Burtech's going to start off, Chris is going to start off with a little blurb on Burtech, and then Jared will present his article. I will then kind of pause and provide a platform for you to answer or to ask any questions. Dr. Fleisig will say a couple housekeeping notes about some upcoming events for ABBS, and then Ben Lerch will present the second article, which this week's theme is on ground reaction force in baseball pitching. So without further ado, let's see, Krista, you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Yes. Thanks so much for having me today. Welcome to Journal Club. Very excited to be here. I'm going to show a quick presentation just to give some insight into Burtech and what we're about and what solutions we might be able to help you with. So my name is Krista Banks. I'm on the product management team at Burtech, and we want to talk about baseball biomechanics today. Founded in 1987, our journey began with the first application of strain gauge technology to the human biomechanics and kinetics. It has since evolved into multiple research, sports, and clinical products. This QR code on the screen will give you a neat history of Burtech and our founder, Dr. Burmy. The key part of connecting our research grade products with our customers and practical use is ensuring our users receive proper education. So that's why we're here today. Today, I want to highlight some of Burtech's sport-specific force plates. They've been used in the baseball community for years, and we also want to share some links to educational materials for baseball and athletic training. First, we'll discuss pitching kinetics. We have a webinar titled Pitching Mechanics and Kinetic Chain Deficits. That QR code is on the top of the screen, so check that out. Force plates, as many of you know, they allow for a detailed assessment of lower body kinetics. That provides necessary feedback on velocity, power generation, and weight transfer. The image on the right shows our fully instrumented mound. This is force plates installed embedded inside concrete in the ground in a standard mound shape. But we recently released a new portable pitching mound as well, that's shown on the left there. The link at the bottom of the page will take you to the page for this mound, but both of these solutions, as you can see, provide different force plates under each foot. This is critical for identifying individual contributions from each leg during the loading and landing phases of pitching. Next, we'll discuss hitting. The QR code on the top of the screen will take you to Burtech's video series on ground reaction force data in the baseball swing. This is a great resource featuring Justin Stone on the use of force plates to analyze hitting mechanics. The image on the right shows Burtech's fully instrumented batter's box installation. This setup shown here shows two force plates on either side of home plate, but we also have a portable swing station, which is linked at the bottom of the page. The big benefit of this product is the flexibility. So you can set it up for left or right-handed batting, or you can move into the catching area for data collection there. So that's an interesting and very flexible product we have. And let's not forget about the weight room. A well-rounded athlete dedicates part of their day to the weight room. So let's explore additional uses for force plates and strength and conditioning. From assessing static and dynamic balance to testing power, force, and jumps, force plates have countless applications here. And our force plates always measure in 6 degrees of freedom, so they can be powerfully used for analysis of complex movements, not just up and down, but side-to-side motion as well. So the link here provides a webinar for the role of force plates in athletic performance. And then finally, even the strongest athletes can struggle without a good reaction time. So we do have some clinical products that provide what you might need in this area. One of our clinical offerings is the Burtec Vision Trainer, or BVT. This is commonly used in physical therapy clinics and athletic training facilities. To learn more about the BVT and how visual processing and reaction times affect you, follow the QR codes here. We've shown a lot of force plates here, but I don't want to leave without mentioning that our force plates can be integrated with several partner products. So if you're looking for optical motion capture, for instance, we integrate with major motion capture companies. Thanks so much for your attention. I wanted to share links here too to our YouTube channels and our blog channels. So check those out. If you weren't able to access any of the QR codes, if I went too quickly, I'm more than happy to share this slideshow and share all those links. But let us know what questions you might have, and enjoy Journal Club.
Thank you, Krista.
Krista,
Sorry,
yeah.
I was just going to ask her to add her information in the chat room.
That's
Sure.
what I was,
Yes.
that's what I was going to say also.
Okay.
I will
Sorry.
do that.
Cool. Any questions for Krista? All right. Thank you. All right. Let's see. Jared, are you ready to go?
I am.
Okay. Go ahead and share your screen.
Can you see it?
I can see it.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. I am Jared Duane. I am a second-year biomedical engineering graduate student here at Wake, currently doing my research in the Wake pitching lab. And my clicker is not working. Oh, there we go. Okay, so today we're going to look at a comparison of ground reaction forces among stride types in baseball pitching. I thought it'd be beneficial to look at all the stride types first before we get into any hypothesis or gaps in research. So first stride type is going to be tall and fall. These pitchers keep their bodies as tall as possible and throw the ball from the highest position during the movement. Next stride is dip and drive or drop and drive. These guys lower their center of gravity to drive or push off the mound to gain momentum. The next stride is going to be mixed. It can be hard to identify these strides. We'll get into that later, but this is a blend between the two strides. These pitchers will start to move forward, then drop dramatically during the stride phase. All right, gaps in current research. Results have varied in studies that examine the pivot leg ground reaction force. Additionally, results have also varied in studies looking at the correlation between ground reaction force and ball velocity. In both cases, researchers reference studies that produce contradicting results from varying nationalities. Diving deeper into this, Asian pitchers versus American pitchers. So these Asian pitchers examined a higher pivot leg ground reaction force and a correlation between ground reaction force and ball velocity, where American pitchers did not show that correlation and examined less pivot leg ground reaction force. Number two, it also remains unclear whether the driving forces of the pivot leg affect the support force from the stride leg to influence pitching performance and injury risk. Differences between baseball cultures and teaching methods may lead to different skills and techniques. Pitchers might differ in their pivot leg ground reaction force patterns because of the country in which they were trained. Purpose and a hypothesis. The purpose of this study was to investigate the different ground reaction force characteristics among stride types and explore the relationship between these variables and the ball velocity individually. They hypothesized that there would be different impulses as well as the amount and timing of the peak value of the ground reaction force among stride types. More specifically, they believe that the DD pitchers would produce a greater push force and less braking force from the stride leg. To dive into this a little bit more, these DD pitchers, I like to think, are in a way jumping down the mound. I know that can scare some people in terms of like player development, but I think in this sense, it will help. So in a sense, kind of creating that greater push force from a greater knee flexion in that pivot leg, and then jumping onto that stride leg, which is that enables some more knee flexion than other strides. Methods and data collection. This study involved 30 Taiwanese male collegiate, college, and professional baseball pitchers. 42 reflective markers were placed on the pitcher to define segments, pitching events, and phases. 2 AMTI force plates were used to measure ground reaction force of the 2 lower extremities and verify the instant of stride foot contact. The force plate that recorded the GRF of the pivot leg was mounted 10 centimeters higher and 65 centimeters behind the force plate that recorded the GRF of the stride leg. So making their own makeshift force plate mound in a sense. This one's a mouthful, but peak value, timing, and impulse of the medial, anterior, vertical, and resultant GRF values were analyzed at stride foot contact, ball release, and stride arm cocking and acceleration phases. This next bullet point will be important later on. Stride phase is going to be your phase 1, and then arm cocking and acceleration is going to be your phase 2. Methods continued. After a warm-up with their personal routine, they were asked to throw 3 strike pitches at max effort, and the data of the fastest strike trial was used for analysis. A radar gun was used to measure ball velocity. Cortex V 7.0 was used to output the raw data of each marker and force plate during pitching. To determine the stride types of pitchers, researchers examined the pelvis center. I've seen this vary between different research projects, but this one, they decided to look at the pelvis. They looked at 2 ACES markers, so left and right, and then 2 on the posterior side as well. So if the trajectory of the pelvis moved forward first, then downward, it was going to be TF, so that tall fall group. If it moved downward first and then forward, it was going to be your DD group. And then forward, followed by quickly downward, dramatically downward was considered your MX. Stat analysis. Of the 3 stride types across stride and arm cocking and acceleration phases were performed individually using SPSS V28. ANOVA was performed for each variable to identify differences among the 3 stride types. For variables with significant differences, the Chef post hoc test was used to identify significant differences between stride type pairs. If equal variance was not assumed, Welch tests were used to identify differences between stride type pairs. Pearson's product moment correlation analysis was used to examine the relationship between each variable of GRF and the ball velocity by each stride type, and a statistical significance was set at 0.05. Results. Sip of water. Results. Stride leg GRF. These results showed no significant differences among the 3 groups in the peak value, peak timing, or the impulse of the GRF of the stride leg in all those directions during the arm cocking and acceleration phases. All right, so pivot leg ground reaction force at stride foot contact. As you can see here, at stride foot contact with the TF group in the anterior direction, TF is going to be significantly greater than your DD group, as well as in the vertical and resultant direction. And then in the resultant and vertical direction, you can add that TF is also significantly greater than that mixed group. What this is saying is that this TF group is still pushing off at stride foot contact, or in general, still using that pivot leg at stride foot contact, where kind of back to what I was saying previously, with the DD group, they're in a way like jumping down the mound and no longer using that pivot leg at stride foot contact. And this is really going to hammer home over the next 2 tables. So max GRF, pivot leg within stride phase, and arm cocking acceleration phase. So we see again the anterior GRF direction in phase 2. So this is going to be your arm cocking and acceleration phase is phase 2. TF is going to be significantly greater than DD. And then once again, within the vertical and resultant direction in phase 2, TF is going to be greater than DD in mixed. Also, it's important to note that the mix is greater in phase 1, which also displays how it is more delayed than the DD group and is going to be significantly greater in that phase 1. So during the stride phase, that mix is actually going to produce more vertical ground reaction force and resultant ground reaction force than the TF group. All right, last table. GRF impulse of the pivot leg in the stride phase and the arm cocking and acceleration phase. We can see here in phase 2 again, in the anterior vertical and resultant direction as well, that TF is going to be significantly greater than the DD group. And then the mix is going to be greater in phase 1 than the DD as well, just kind of speaking to how that mix again is a little bit more delayed. I thought this graph was worth noting as well. This is the total pivot leg vertical GRF throughout the sequence. Vertical GRF of pivot leg. As you can see here, the TF is more of a like continuous push past stride foot contact as well, while the DD and mixed group kind of have a dramatic increase and then drop off even more past stride foot contact. Results, ball velocity and pivot leg. The ball velocity among the 3 stride types showed no significant differences. However, there were some important correlations worth noting. For TF pitchers, there were positive correlations between ball velocity and vertical GRF at stride foot contact, maximum results in GRF in the stride phase, and maximum vertical GRF in the arm cocking and acceleration phase of the pivot leg. For DD pitchers, there were positive correlations between ball velocity and vertical and resultant GRF in the stride phase. For MX pitchers, there are positive correlations between ball velocity and the maximum anterior value and timing of the GRF in the stride phase of the pivot leg. Ball velocity with the stride leg. Once again, there was no the ball velocity among the 3 stride types showed no significant differences, but there are some important correlations. For TF pitchers, there was a negative correlation between ball velocity and medial GRF of the stride leg and the arm cocking acceleration phase. For DD pitchers, there was a positive correlation between ball velocity and the resultant GRF of the stride leg and the arm cocking acceleration phase. For MX pitchers, there was a positive correlation between ball velocity and medial GRF of the stride leg and the arm cocking acceleration phase. Some limitations, the stride force plate was flat, not at an angle like a mound, and pitchers were not allowed to wear spikes, so didn't necessarily represent a real pitch from a mound. Also a small population, TF6, DD12, mix 12. I know there was a study from Auburn that just came out recently, and they looked at Kinetrac's data from in-game, and they had 64 pitchers. So I think that's also like a future direction worth noting, that we're able to use that markerless data from in-game. It will be a lot more accurate. Some take-home messages. Differences only occurred in the pivot leg. I think that's the biggest like take-home message there. DD pitchers press their bodies forward earlier during the stride phase. MX pitchers press slightly later but generate more impulse than DD. TF pitchers use their pivot leg differently, is more of a continuous pressing that increases during the stride phase and then still maintaining that force after stride foot contact, which generates more impulse than DD. The DD pitchers generated more press force, which decreased the loading of the upper extremities and lowered the risk of injury to the upper extremities. The 30 Taiwanese pitchers recorded less GRF values than previous Asian studies, although the GRFs were still higher than previous studies on American pitchers. I've been studying baseball biomechanics I've been here a year now, but I would say more intensely over the past 5 or 6 months. And I think this was my biggest takeaway, is the difference in cultural player developments based on body size. So like due to differences in body size and physical characteristics, it was suggested that Asian pitchers could pitch just as fast as Western pitchers by adopting this DD technique. And then here's a summary slide that we can do questions off of.
All right. Awesome job. Awesome job, Jared. Have any questions for Jared on this particular paper? Comparison of ground reaction force among stride types in baseball pitching.
Hello.
Yes?
I'm Dennis Shavelson, Dr. Shavelson, and I'm a human movement specialist and health coach. And I'm curious if any of these studies have looked into the different types of feet and how they would drive GRF in terms of delivering a pivot leg.
Could you explain a little bit more in terms of difference of feet?
I could get less sophisticated by saying low, medium, or high arch, or there's a foot typing system that basically shows whether or not there's weakness in the back of the foot, the front of the foot, or both. And in general, if there's forefoot weakness that can be fixed, we should be able to deliver more GRF once we fix the foot.
Yeah, I personally haven't seen studies on that, but that would be very interesting to look into or even conduct that study.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Jared? Adam?
Hey Jared, great presentation. Just wanted to ask, so when it came down, when they were analyzing the results, they took the fastest pitch of the three. And when they compared the pitch speeds to each of the different stride styles, they showed there was no significant difference. Do you think if they averaged up the different pitches together instead of taking the fastest pitch of all three, do you think there would be some kind of difference significantly since there was some kind of correlation?
Yeah, that's something that I struggled with as well as I was reading. I was like, oh, there are all these correlational differences between within each stride type and the ball velocity. So yeah, I think that's definitely worth noting that it is something that we could look into more. And I kind of wish they did too, because the more pitches, the better, honestly. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Jared, can you go back to your last slide there with the summary and take-home messages? I
Yeah,
think it was just the previous slide that you had up.
that's one.
Let's see. Given that the authors reported that there were no differences in pitch velocity between all three types, I mean, how do we know, I guess from their population, which one is the more efficient or the best, I guess, mechanism by which, a pitcher can go down a mound? And first of all, it wasn't really a mound, right? It was just two
Yeah.
force plates at different heights. So I think, I read the study, and given that, there were no differences in ball velocity, we really don't know, which one is more efficient, and they didn't measure kinetics, if I'm not mistaken. Am I correct?
No, they did not. They did not look at injury metrics at all, if that's what you're asking.
Right, right. So you said here, which DD pitchers generate more press force, which decreased the loading of the upper extremities and lowered the risk of injury to the upper extremities. Are you basing that off
Yeah, they
previous
referenced
research, or?
Yeah, previous research that they referenced in the study. Yes.
Okay, all right. Oh, got another question?
Jeff has a question.
Jerry.
Yes,
Yeah, Jeff.
thank you. Great job. Love the article and enjoyed the comments so far. Just a quick one. If anybody is contemplating replicating it or trying to work on this type of project in the future, if you're going to measure the center of the pelvis as being a critical marker, they're probably in the first analysis or demographics inclusion of whether or not you've measured range of motion at the hip passively, because what's going to happen is, since your marker is the center between the anterior superior iliac spine, the front of your pelvis, and the posterior superior iliac spine, the tighter that someone's hip flexors are, or the weaker that someone's lower abdominal muscles are, any one of a number of things, the more forward tilting of the pelvis you're going to get as the person strides forward. So you're going to have a migration based upon the fact that if their muscles are tight, you're going to get an anti-tilting of the pelvis no matter what. So you'd like to kind of know if you're starting out with a relatively homogeneous group just in terms of their baseline flexibility. And that's not an impossibly hard thing to add, but it may create some nuances of what's going on with the group, particularly as was originally pointed out. The numbers are small. So if you have like 3 or 4 who all of a sudden really are severely restricted in terms of their hip flexors, that can affect the result, given you only have 30 people.
No, that's a good point, Jeff. I wonder, so they were just simply using that pelvic, I don't know if they were going to call it the segmental center of mass, or just simply the midpoint of the two ASISs, to indicate whether or not they were tall and fall, or the DD group, right? Like the DD group was supposed to be forward and then down, while the TF group was vice versa. So I wonder if a better indicator would be the center of mass, right? Just look at either the displacement or the velocity of the whole body center of mass.
Yeah, I've seen center of mass be used, and then also the angle of the lead knee flexion as well. of that stride foot has been used to for classification of each stride.
Gotcha. Also, one last thing, I believe you mentioned, or yeah, you did mention that the correlation between the GRF variables and ball velocity of the stride leg, there was a negative correlation between velocity and what
Medial
was it? The medial lateral
GRF. So
component of the GRF on the tall and fall, correct?
yes, yes.
But not with the DD and mixed groups. Can you comment as to why that would be a negative correlation versus the other two?
Yeah, I definitely can comment on why it would be a negative correlation just in terms of like energy leaking out to the side instead of back through that kinematic sequence and shooting back up through the hip. But not in the sense of DD and mix. That is a good question that I'm kind of perplexed about as well.
So the tall and fall group, correct me if I'm wrong, they lay back longer, right? They have more contributions from the background reaction force as compared to the DD and mixed group. Am I correct in my assessment? And so the pelvis and the trunk is rotating. So now they got this foundation in which they're rotating, towards home plate into their arm cocking, arm acceleration. So that provides them that foundation. So you could see that would make sense in the medial lateral component, right? That the GRF is somehow giving that same foundation on which pelvic rotation, trunk rotation, and the rest of the kinetic chain can occur. So I don't know if they mentioned that in their discussion, but that was an interesting finding. That it was actually a pretty strong correlation, right? It was negative 0.9, I think it was, as compared to the DD and mixed groups.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to comment?
Arnell, I'll just give a quick comment and then I'll give my intermission thing here. First of all, I think Jared, you did a nice job, either you or the authors, saying let's not overreach because there were only a limited number of subjects in the study. And so I think it's more kind of descriptive of the different groups versus the correlations. Plus, they were on flat. So for all those reasons, I don't think it's the definitive study. Secondly, when people are mostly foreign, non-English speaking, I don't like how they have all these abbreviations and everything, TFs and DD, but English isn't their first language. But again, DD I think is the drop and drive. But speaking about Asian, I think it is an interesting topic they touched on about Asians versus American pitchers. And I do think some of our studies have shown that the Asian pitchers tend to pause and do more of a drop and drive. And I think that's beyond this study, but that is there. Arnell, may I now give my little...
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay, you can... Okay, so thanks for everyone coming for Journal Club. We will do this again next month in November. In December, we are going to be at the MLB winter meetings instead. And so the MLB winter meetings, I think, hopefully everyone got this. Let me send this here. I'm going to show you my email. Arnell, you guys see my email on your screen?
Yeah, it's coming up.
So in December, live in Dallas, Texas, we're going to have 5 posters presented. So the due date is a few weeks from now, October 31st. So I'll put my the email address in the chat. But essentially, if you want to come and present a poster of your work, not a Journal Club work, but your original work, there's a link here to submit an abstract and come to the Major League Baseball winter meetings in Dallas, Texas.
Dr. Fleisig, can you put those links up on the chat?
Will do.
Awesome. All right, Benjamin, you ready to go?
All right.
Floor is yours.
All right, hopefully you guys can see my screen here. Perfect. Well, first off, thanks everyone for coming out. Jared, I thought your presentation was really nice. If anyone was listening to Jared's presentation and was like, oh, this is pretty interesting, like tall and fall versus drop and drive, I'll give a little shameless plug. Our lab did just publish an article using Kinetitrax data looking at tall and fall and drop and drive strategies. And the analysis was a bit different and the results were really interesting. So Kevin Giordano in our lab just put out a pretty good article about that. I definitely recommend it. If you like this topic, We're gonna do a little bit of a different topic here. We're gonna shy away from drop and drive and tall and fall, and instead look at the impact of drive leg impulse and slope on velocity and some kinematics. Research coming out of Wake Forest here with Dr. Glover and colleagues. My name is Ben Lerch. I'm currently a PhD student and a research fellow at Auburn University in our sports medicine and movement lab, and I also work with our KinderTrack system in Auburn baseball. So this is a pretty interesting topic here. I felt like it might be good to give a quick refresher on what we do know about ground reaction forces, specifically the drive leg or the back leg. Just a few years ago, also out of Wake Forest, Nicholson's article with machine learning found that, interestingly, maximum drive leg ground reaction force resultant really wasn't a significant predictor of ball velocity. And then just earlier last year, Kyle Wasserberger and Kevin Giordano found there was no significant association between drive leg ground reaction forces and pitch velocity using statistical parametric mapping. So that kind of brings us to where we are. Well, what about, say, drive leg impulse and drive leg slope? So what are those two things? Well, drive leg impulse, as defined in this study, is the integral of the ground reaction force from the time of peak knee height until the time of, I have ball release there, but that should be foot contact. And so it can kind of vary here. The authors gave two hypothetical what this would look like for some pitchers. So say in the purple shaded area, you could have a little bit less ground reaction force impulse there, but then a quicker unloading with that slope, or you could hold it for longer and then have a less steep slope. So you can kind of think about this as the mathematical representation of, say, holding the rubber. The authors hypothesized that increased drive leg impulse and increased drive leg slope would be positively correlated with ball velocity. And they also looked at rotational velocity, so pelvis, trunk, and humerus here. So this study was a pretty simple retrospective review of data collected at Wake Forest Pitching Lab. They had 174 pitchers here. And take a note here of the demographics here. Mostly high school pitchers, 109, and then a relatively smaller number of youth pitchers, college pitchers, and elite pitchers all included. Data was collected with a 12-camera marker-based motion capture, and they also had AMTI force plates. I believe they chose between 2 and 5 fastballs here, depending on the pitcher, to analyze, and then ground reaction forces were normalized by body weight. And for our statistical analysis, simple linear regressions were used to assess between our drive leg impulse, drive leg slope, and then both ball velocity and our rotational velocities. So the results here are pretty interesting, and I think it'll make for a good discussion. If we put all of those pitchers, all 174 pitchers, into a simple linear regression, you do get a significant negative correlation between the impulse, so the shaded area under the curve, and ball velocity. And so they found that if you increase your area under the curve, you're going to throw slower. But it's kind of interesting if we look at the subgroup level, if we run regressions for youth, high school, elite, and college, there were no significant correlations between the impulse and velocity. If we look at the impulse and our kinematics, the only significant association when looking at this entire cohort again was they found a negative association between drive leg impulse and maximum trunk rotational velocity. But interestingly, no subgroup analysis reported. So just keep these findings in mind for just a second. If we look at the slope, and essentially like how fast are we shifting our weight, how fast are we unloading, looking at that entire cohort again, all those 170 pitchers, there's no significant correlation between the slope and ball velocity. And just like our previous finding, there's no significant correlations at the subgroup levels either. If we look at the effect of the slope on kinematics, looking at the pelvis, trunk, and humerus, again, there's just no significance reported. So before we talk about this discussion and like actually think about what these results mean practically, I think it's really important to take a stab at some limitations of the study. From the authors, they admitted that the distribution of our player ages was definitely skewed towards younger, specifically high school pitchers. And they also said, you know, we're throwing in the lab, we're only throwing fastballs. So there are limitations with that as well. Although not much you can do about that. Now, my takeaways here are a little bit different. I think that the skewed distribution of player ages is definitely could be causing some issues here. And I think that analyzing by the subgroup is probably a more accurate representation of what's going on. I also think that looking at individual forces, like our last paper looked at, might be more effective to tease out what the actual effects of ground reaction force are instead of just doing the resultant vector. In terms of statistics, it could have been interesting to use multiple regression to assess collinearity. But overall, I just couldn't help but feel that something just didn't feel right with our drive leg impulse correlation from the study. And what I mean by that is I wonder if we're dealing with a problem with outliers in the data, specifically this point that I've circled in red. Because when we look at our entire cohort here with drive leg impulse and ball velocity, there is a significant negative correlation. But if you look at the subgroup betas here, elite, college, and high school, the betas really aren't that large. And the only one that's really larger is the youth. And so I'm wondering if the reason we see a significant negative association with the whole subgroup is this one pitcher right here, which might be an outlier. So I wanted to see what everyone else thinks here. But if we do a quick summary here, it looks like we're trying to figure out with the study what the effects of drive leg impulse are. It doesn't look like there really is any significant correlation, especially at the subgroup level between both drive leg impulse and slope on ball velocity. And so my big take home message is just that, right? At the subgroup level, it doesn't seem that we have correlations. And number two, you might want to check your data for outliers. From personal experience, I know that they certainly can mess up your analysis. But with that, I wanted to open it up to anyone if there's any questions.
All right, great job, Benjamin. Questions on this paper?
Okay, I'll start it.
All right.
By the way, I did appreciate last group that between the two doctors talking about how physical things such as the feet and the hips are important for looking at the biomechanics. I think that was really good in the last one. Okay, on this one, Ben, I totally agree with you that that the diversity from the youth through the pros mixed together is not the best way to go, and the sub-analysis is better. That being said, the study had a lot of strengths in that they had a good number of people, not 10 or 20 people, they had 100 something people, plus they were on a sloped mound, which is really a nice feature of their Wake Forest lab there. So that being said, Ben, I don't know if you agree with me, they had 14 elite, whatever that means, and 20 college and 10 pros, but they had 100 something high school right there. I think what they should really focus on is the 109 high school pitchers. It's hard to make a correlation for the 14 or 20 of the other groups. I think the strength of their study would have been, do they have correlations within high school pitchers? Or maybe even high school and college, combine them. But yeah, that's my point.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure if any of the authors are on here. I'm not sure what the justification was for throwing youth and college and elite in here, but I think just sticking with high school pitchers would have probably made for a stronger study.
Sorry, and one last thing, Ben, put back the original correlation where it shows the p-value is less than whatever. P is less than 0.01, but r squared is 0.09. So because they have a lot of data, they found a significant thing, but the correlation or the contribution is very low. So you have to look at the p-value and the r value, and the fact that the r squared value is low means what we see there, which is the dots are all over the place.
Yeah, just barely a moderate effect size there.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Jeff?
point,
Go ahead. We'll start with Jeff first. He had a hand up.
Oh, thank you. I'm not going to do any anatomy or other stuff on this one, I promise. But I want to add on to what Ben and Glenn just said. if you decide to data snoop a little bit when you write to the extent you can on figure 3, I think it's not only the outlier that Ben was identifying was important, but if you go and you look at the triangles, which are the elites, their distribution really is different from, as Glenn said, you would be better off looking at the high school. In fact, if you look at the elite, the outlier is actually the very first one, who's at over 90 miles an hour and at 0.4 for the drive leg impulse. The rest of the triangles, if you look, there's actually an upward trend if you were doing a simple linear regression for just that small number of people. So you actually had that small group, because look under the line of best fit. Where are the triangles? They're not there. And so the thing is that it may in fact be diluting some of the product here, because trying to, even though you got a great number of people, you are not getting the same type of effect. So I agree with both Ben's and Glenn's observations and proposals there.
Any other comments, questions?
Hello.
I had one. Go ahead.
No, Dr. Shavelson again. So I'm sort of, actually, I'm very much so coming from a different position in terms of most of my work is stochastic instead of deterministic. And I don't know if you agree, but in my estimation or opinion, the drive leg is the driving force of a pitch is coming from the back leg and its attachment and function off the rubber. And if you're coming up with both studies that there's virtually no difference, that in other words, that there's no way that you can mechanize or manipulate the drive leg power that's coming off the pitch, it seems like it's something that baseball is leaving out dramatically. I'll use the analogy of a 100-yard dash, where there's the starting blocks and the push off the starting block. When you fix the foot, so to speak, or the plant, or the way it's touching the blocks, you get a change in the starting velocity.
All right. Okay, thank you. Ben, you made a point about they use simple regressions separately, I believe, between drive leg impulse and drive leg slope and velocity kinematics, respectively.
Mhm.
In your opinion, you mentioned about doing a multiple regression instead. What would you include in that multiple regression in that model?
I mean, I thought it would have just been interesting to do both drive leg slope and impulse as a multiple regression to see if there's collinearity there between those two variables.
Right. I think an extension of that, because you're looking at ground reaction force components, like that's number one. You should using separate components of the ground reaction force would have been insightful, but also they normalize their kinetics, and for a good reason, because you're including a pretty diverse population here in the sample. But including mass and height separately as independent variables into the multiple regression, I think might have helped with in terms of the correction, if you will, and finding potentially these relationships between, or predictors, I should say, of the velocity and whatever kinematics they included in their model. So, I agree with you, Ben, that perhaps not just simply looking at these kind of one-way linear regressions separately and even between these subgroups, you could probably extend from that and include these other variables into a multivariate model here.
Mhm.
Any other questions, comments? Let's see. Dr. Fleisig, you had some comments about potentially the two studies together. I mean, this is one theme on ground reaction force. How can we put the results that they publish into evidence, into practice? So Jared and Ben, I'll put the question to you, like take-home messages that you want to get from both of these studies together that potentially could be beneficial for what we do in baseball.
I mean, I can start with that. I think
Yeah.
when looking at Jared's study, and I think Jared, you said it, you nailed it right on the head. I don't know how much conclusions you can draw from a sample size of 6 for tall and ball pitchers, you know, and so I would almost wonder if when we look at these studies, is it better to, instead of grouping our people or treating it as a continuous variable like we talked about in our last journal club. So those were the thoughts that I had in terms of actually applying this into the field. Maybe grouping isn't the best strategy, especially with lower sample sizes to begin with.
And also, just to piggyback off of that as well, I know, Ben, you plugged your Auburn Kinetrack study as well with the in-game data. I think that's fantastic as well because you're actually looking at data from an in-game scenario, and because you'll get a lot of limitations as well in those lab settings. It can never replicate what these guys are doing on the field. So getting that sample size higher with that Kinetrax or any sort of markerless data, I think, is a great future direction and good take-home message for anybody that wants to replicate a study like this.
Matt, you got a question or comment?
Yeah, I was just curious, these studies are looking a lot at the relationship between the ground reaction forces and the ball velocity, but is there a different output that is more critical to the pitch that, I mean, obviously we want to throw harder, but, and, we see these weak relationships. Is there other parts of the kinematic chain that we should be looking at instead in terms of the relationships between what you're generating at the ground? Is it peak pelvis rotation? Is it your trunk acceleration? Is there something else that is more important or more significant to the pitch that should be looking at?
Yeah, I think the second paper looked at other kinematics in the pitching motion, right? The angle velocities of the pelvis and the trunk and the shoulder.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's a good point. The paper did look at simple linear associations between drive leg impulse and slope on the pelvis, trunk, and the shoulder, or they call it humerus. They didn't find anything, but again, I'm not sure if that's really because there wasn't anything to find, or if it's because they were looking at just the resultant vector and not decomposing that into the X, Y, and Z forces.
To the multiple components,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's a great point. I was wondering that too. Yeah.
Well, I guess the key thing is what do we define within the kinetic chain, the kinematics, that operation defines performance as a pitcher, right? We keep using pitching velocity. Now with Kinetrax data and Hawkeye data, can we couple that with spin rates and efficiencies and horizontal break? I mean, we know that's going to be effective what the pitcher does, potentially the ground reaction force, and ultimately what the pitcher does throughout the pitching motion is going to affect where that ball goes and how it gets to the home plate, right? And then on the injury risk side, we typically just use kinetics, right? Shoulder and elbow kinetics. And is there something else within those variables that can operationally define performance as a pitcher and injury risk? And maybe we can try to, make these more actionable, right? If we see a difference, tall and fall and DD and mix and, these different groups, how can we make these actionable so that we can, talk to our S&C, our athletic trainers and coaches to make better decisions about our players. Right. Cool. Any other last minute thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment on all that. Arnell, you've done a bit of work on like segment power flow analyses and things like that, but have you looked at it at all through the lower body at all? And I wonder if you could kind of what Matt was saying. I think some of those techniques would help understand the differences in
Yeah,
these
so
and how that goes through.
we did a couple studies with Dr. Nicholson at Wake Forest, and we looked at energy flow through the pelvis, right? So back hip, front hip, L5S1, and we looked at the relationships between stride leg and drive leg ground reaction force and impulse with energy flow through the pelvis, with the idea being that the pelvis and trunk is the core power, if you will, of the pitch. And we found that it was actually the medial lateral, the transverse plane rotations of both the drive side and front side that were the significant predictors of energy flow through the pelvis. But, we haven't done a full body one. We don't know how that looks at the shoulder. So there are still questions to be asked on how energy generation, absorption, and transfer is affected by what they do in the lower half. because ultimately that's what we're trying to find is how do we connect, ground reaction force to the last segment of the kinetic chain, which is the throwing arm, right? The elbow and the wrist and the ball. So there's still a lot of work to do, and I invite our students and professional members of the society to join our research interest groups that we have on LinkedIn. We talk about energy flow, ground reaction force, kinematics, not just in pitching, but also in hitting. So this would be a good opportunity to potentially collaborate with the number of labs and organizations around the country and around the world that are interested in this space. Shameless plug for rigs. Cool. Any other questions or comments? Just looking here, looking at the chat. Just want to thank our presenters today. You guys did a wonderful job in presenting the work from both of these papers. We will be back next month in November, first Monday in November. I forgot the exact date. But then, like Dr. Fleisig said, we do have our winter meetings in December. So please, if you're interested, please submit an abstract. There's also a travel grant that potentially could fund, a part of your expenses to Dallas for the winter meetings. And also want to thank Krista from BirdTech. Thank you for presenting today and being a sponsor for today's Journal Club. And we'll see everybody hopefully next month.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much.